When a Christian prays for their loved one who's suffering from cancer, and then the person suffering from cancer goes into remission, there's a correlation there, and we as human beings are tempted to attribute to that correlation more than what it deserves. People do go into remission when they get cancer. It happens. It's rare, but it happens. And given the number of people in the world who are religious, and the number of people in the world who, when they get cancer, have people praying for them, it's not surprising that every now and then a cancer sufferer goes into remission who just so happen to have had people praying for them in the months leading up to said remission. Hello everybody, you are listening to the Magic Skeptic, aka Magic Dara, and you are all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts, or should I perhaps call the show An Atheist's Thoughts? Any of you long-term listeners will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. Look guys, it's no secret to any of you that I've been banging on this atheist drum for quite a while now, but what's interesting is I was looking through my back catalogue of videos just recently, and it dawned on me that I actually haven't addressed the arguments for God's existence. I mean, perhaps I've discussed them tangentially at one point or another, but never really took them on, head on, really. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to make a series of videos where I address the arguments for God's existence, because in the past I've, spoken about atheism. I've spoken about whether or not religion has utility, how to deal with death as an atheist, and so forth. If you're interested in any of those topics, please do check out my back catalogue. But as I said, I've never really addressed the arguments for God's existence directly. And so, now's a good time to do that. I hope you guys will join me on this journey. And so, just taking some baby steps today, one of the things that I believe in quite strongly as a human being, and not only an atheist, perhaps as a skeptic. Remember, I'm a skeptic first and an atheist second. I always remember Matt Dillahunty, a very popular atheist in the atheist community of Austin, saying that he's a skeptic first and an atheist second, and I love his reasoning. You see, he would not be an atheist in the morning if somebody provided good evidence for God's existence, but he would still be a skeptic, because a skeptic would have no problem believing in God if indeed there was evidence to believe in God. And so I have to defer to Matt Dillahunty's reasoning here and say that I am absolutely a skeptic first and an atheist second. I would have no problem at all accepting the existence of God if somebody were to demonstrate it. My skepticism would require that I believe in God in such an instance. So, with that in mind, the reason I'm an atheist, guys, is because I just don't see good evidence to believe in God. I just don't see it. I don't see good evidentiary warrant to accept the proposition God exists. And that's it, really. End of video. Thank you very much for watching. Of course not. Well, one of the things that irritates me as a philosopher, a skeptic, and an atheist is that when I ask for evidence for God's existence, every now and then you'll have a theist or a religious apologist of some description say something along the lines of this: "Oh, how silly of you, dear atheist, looking for evidence for a metaphysical entity. Oh my God, you're so ridiculous." That is the kind of response you get. In other words, they're essentially alleging that it is silly or irrational or foolish to one extent or another to expect to find evidence for the existence of God.
When it comes to the issue of God, I don't think that you can prove that there is a God, and I don't think that you can prove there's not a God. So trying to merely figure out a spiritual being through scientific rationalism, I don't think that's the place that you would find God. He's not able to be verified in a test tube.
When we just look at reality, we know that the one who brought it into existence is necessarily not confined by its parameters. Theology speaks of God as being transcendent and also immanent. So to look for God by the scientific method is to commit a category mistake. God is not going to be able to be put in the scientific lab or put in a beaker and then try to determine what he is and what he's like. He is the very ground of existence itself.
And they say this, of course, because the God they believe in, or the God that they allege exists, is, as I alluded to a moment ago, a metaphysical entity. Now, what is a metaphysical entity? What they're actually saying is that God exists beyond space and time. God is a spaceless, timeless, and immaterial being, right? And so to ask for physical evidence would, in the view of certain theists, be an irrational request. How could there be physical evidence of a non-physical entity? How could we detect in space and time an atemporal, spaceless, and immaterial being? That doesn't make sense, or so they would claim. But there's a very interesting problem with such a claim. If indeed this being that you believe in is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, how did you ever come to believe in it in the first place? Right? Is that not a profound and essential question for these people to answer? How did you come to believe, rationally, in this entity that you claim resides beyond space and time? What reason or evidence could there possibly be? And that's the question I want to address in this video. I want to address this allegation, if you will, from certain cohorts in the theistic community that to require evidence for a god is to one extent or another irrational, because, as you've probably guessed, I think that this particular argument coming out of religious apologetics is one of the most ridiculous arguments on offer. So let's jump into it, and I'll explain what's wrong with it right now. So, is it inappropriate to require evidence for the existence of a metaphysical entity? Well, the first thing to consider is what kind of God that people believe in. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm discussing the theistic God, the God of the major monotheisms, those being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And if you look at the God archetype in those religions, what you'll discover is that they believe in what I would refer to as an interventionist God. The kind of God that creates the world in 7 days. The kind of God that can answer prayers and send his only begotten Son to die on the cross for our sins. If indeed you believe in this kind of interventionist God, the kind of God that can answer prayers, for example, then in principle this God should be detectable. There should be some physical evidence or some kind of observation that we could make in reality that would confirm, or at least hint at, and allow us to infer the existence of such a deity. And so, to me, it's ridiculous to say that we shouldn't be looking for physical evidence, especially if the kind of God you believe in is an interventionist God. Such a God would leave breadcrumbs or some kind of a footprint that we could discover. But of course, theists will very often argue that to expect scientific evidence for this metaphysical entity is, again, irrational. But let's explore that claim for a moment. Is God a scientific claim? Now, I believe it was Stephen Jay Gould who said that religion and science are non-overlapping magisteria. But if I'm being honest, I'm not necessarily convinced by that idea. Let's look at the God claim, specifically the God claim of the major monotheisms. These believers allege that their God created the universe. That is a claim about cosmology. They also claim that this God is the creator of life as we know it. That is a claim about biology. And they also allege that this God is the author of our morality. That, to me, is remarkably similar to a claim about psychology. You see, guys, these claims trespass, in the words of Sam Harris, explicitly into the domain of scientific inquiry. And if you were going to enter that domain, then you better bring your evidence. And if you're not going to bring evidence, all you have at the end of the day is a list of assertions. And as Christopher Hitchens put it, and I quote him all the time saying this, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed as such. But as I alluded to earlier, there's an even bigger problem with the suggestion that it's irrational to require evidence for the existence of a metaphysical God. And that is the problem of how you came to believe in this God in the beginning. Now, as far as I can tell, there are two responses that theists tend to offer in response to this criticism of mine. The first one is faith. They come to believe in God through faith. Now, in all of my studies of religion, the word faith, as far as I can tell, is deployed in contexts where there isn't any evidence. And remember, the very theists we're discussing in this video are the theists who would suggest that a requirement for evidence is to one extent or another unreasonable. So when they suggest that faith is the reason for believing, what recourse am I left with but to interpret the word faith as the following: believing in spite of the absence of evidence. Now, if that's what you're going to do, at least you're wearing your irrationality on your sleeve, right? I mean, I could just as easily say that I don't believe in God and that I take my proposition on faith. You see, guys, that's the problem with faith. Faith is not a reliable pathway to truth. I could believe anything on faith. I could believe that the moon is made of cheese on faith. And when you rightly questioned me and asked me for my evidence, and I responded by saying, well, I just believe it. I believe on faith that the moon is made of cheese. I think you'd be completely justified in suggesting that I'm a completely irrational human being, and that my belief is not grounded, that my belief does not contain within it a satisfactory evidentiary warrant. And you'd be right. So forgive me, guys, but when religious people deploy the word faith in defense of their beliefs, I just can't take it seriously, I'm afraid. I just can't. Remember, there are thousands of mutually incompatible religions, many of which deploy faith in defense of their beliefs. So if we have Proposition A, which is in contradiction to Proposition B, and the adherents of both propositions are deploying faith as their reason for holding dear what they believe, then how am I ever going to get to the end point here? How am I ever going to determine which of them, if any, are true? And the short answer is you can't. Faith is not a justification for believing what you believe. It isn't. It never was, it isn't now, and it never will be. So at this point, I have to address a particular irony. If a theist is going to suggest that my requirement for evidence is unreasonable, and in the same breath suggest that the reason they believe is faith, one can't help but laugh at that idea. I mean, how ridiculous. You're going to call me irrational because I require evidence, and you're going to suggest that you're reasonable for not requiring it. I mean, are we living in topsy-turvy land? What kind of thinking is that? Again, I don't say this often, but I have to say it now. I just don't respect that kind of thinking, guys. I just don't respect it. I'm not saying I don't respect the individuals. Remember, there's a big difference between attacking an individual and attacking their beliefs. And if your belief is such that you believe that a requirement of evidence is irrational, while simultaneously believing that blind faith is an acceptable reason to believe what you believe, then you're just intellectually ridiculous. And I can't take your position seriously. So just to reiterate what we've discussed thus far, remember, certain theists will claim that to require evidence of a metaphysical God is unreasonable, because a metaphysical God by its very nature is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, and so it would be foolish to expect to find any evidence manifesting in our reality. My response to this, if you recall, is to ask of these theists how they came to believe in such an entity to begin with. If indeed there's no evidence that manifests in our reality, how could one possibly rationally come to the conclusion that such an entity exists? What we've seen thus far is that one response offered by theists is that of faith, and I think you can see that the faith argument is ridiculous. The other response that theists offer is that of personal revelation, that they had some kind of an experience, divine or otherwise, that changed their mind. It might have been a feeling of divine bliss. It might have been a sense of God's presence while praying, or something of that nature. It might have even been a completely transformative religious experience where they witnessed an apparition of some description, or had an experience that was to one extent or another ineffable, a word that we use in comparative religions to describe an experience which is indescribable, but still leaves an incredible impact on the experiencer. My problem with personal revelation as a reason for believing in God is that we don't have a mechanism for differentiating between a lunatic and a person who has experienced a genuine religious experience. How would one differentiate between those two? If I'm being brutally honest, when I go to bed tonight and I lay me down to sleep, if an angel visits me in my bedroom, my first thought isn't going to be, oh my God, it's all true. Angels are real. I'm going to heaven if I'm a good person, etc., etc. My first thought will be, goodness, I've lost my mind. It's time to go to the hospital. Now, how do we tell the difference between the madman and the religious adherent who has experienced a genuine road to Damascus experience, like St. Paul? And it's not clear to me that a mechanism for differentiating between these two ideas, these two possibilities, has ever been demonstrated. And straight away, we're back to faith. Guys, illusions and delusions are real to those who are experiencing them. And so while it might be a good reason for you to believe, albeit I would suggest it's not, because you can't be sure that you're not just losing your mind. You might be suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, for example. There are some scholars who suggest that the entire biblical narrative and St. Paul's road to Damascus experience is best explained by temporal lobe epilepsy or a similar mental phenomenon, right? If that's the case, the whole thing just crumbles. Now, I'm not claiming that I know that. I'm just pointing out that there are naturalistic explanations where we don't have to defer to metaphysical entities, miracles, gods, and Jesus Christ. We don't need to defer to any of that. It certainly isn't rational to accept any of that. And again, I'm not suggesting that it's rational to accept that all of this is explained by temporal lobe epilepsy or other mental phenomena. I'm simply pointing out, if I'm being brutally honest, that I don't know why people have these experiences, but they don't know either. And so you don't get to use that as a justification for believing in a God that doesn't leave any trace evidence behind. Religious experiences cannot be marshaled as evidence in favor of your theistic beliefs. It just doesn't work that way. Until you can come up with a mechanism for differentiating delusion from genuine religious experiences, if they're even possible to begin with, until you come up with that mechanism, your religious experiences are not going to convince any budding skeptic, certainly not myself. So in conclusion, guys, I'd like to address a question that many of you might be thinking, and it's this: what kind of evidence would I accept for the existence of a god or gods? And again, I have to defer to Matt Dillahunty in this moment. Matt Dillahunty's answer is great. What he says is that he doesn't know what evidence would convince him, but if there is a God, that God would know. You see, guys, if I attempt to come up with some kind of evidence here, there's going to be flaws in it. You know, if I said good evidence would be that when I go to bed tonight, an angel appears. I mean, I've already addressed that. How would I know that I'm not suffering from a delusion? If I walk outside my door today and I look up into the sky and the clouds are taking the shape, believe in me. Again, that might be compelling to some of you, but how do I know that I'm not suffering from a delusion? How would I know that the clouds didn't just randomly order themselves into such a shape? I mean, any of you who have had a childhood like mine will know that you can play the shape game with the clouds, and some of the shapes that the clouds produce randomly are incredibly eerie and serendipitous. I mean, it's quite strange what can happen, but that is the nature of randomness. Randomness will every now and then produce a pattern that we as human beings, because we are pattern-seeking animals, will read into a little bit too much. And as a skeptic, I have to resist that urge. When a Christian prays for their loved one who's suffering from cancer, and then the person suffering from cancer goes into remission, there's a correlation there, and we as human beings are tempted to attribute to that correlation more than what it deserves. People do go into remission when they get cancer. It happens. It's rare, but it happens. And given the number of people in the world who are religious and the number of people in the world who, when they get cancer, have people praying for them, it's not surprising that every now and then a cancer sufferer goes into remission who just so happened to have had people praying for them in the months leading up to said remission. So guys, when you ask me for evidence of the divine, I have to defer to Matt Dillahunty's answer. I don't know what would convince me, but if the God you believe in truly exists, that God would know what would convince me. And so if you're up there, God, or down there, or outside of space and time, wherever you are, and you're listening right now, you know what would convince me. Bring it on, my friend. I would love to know what's true. At the end of the day, that's what this channel is all about. I want to believe, again in the words of Matt Dillahunty, goodness, this has become the Matt Dillahunty show. Again in the words of Matt Dillahunty, I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. So speaking of Matt Dillahunty, I want to close this video by showing you a little clip of Matt in action. And if you haven't watched The Atheist Experience or Matt's recent show, The Hang Up, I couldn't recommend more highly that you do. Before we get to that clip, I just want to ask you that if you did like the video, please do consider dropping a like on it. And if you've been enjoying my content more generally, please do consider hitting that subscribe button. And if you do, don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys, and I will leave you in the hands of the awesome, brilliant Matt Dillahunty. All the best. Bye-bye.
So there's two possibilities. Either God manifests in reality or it doesn't. Now, if it doesn't manifest in reality, my contention is that this God is indistinguishable from a God that doesn't exist, because we only are able to actually examine things that manifest in reality. So you can think that there's a God out there that doesn't manifest in reality, and you have no rational justification for it. And what you believe in is indistinguishable to you and every other thinking being on this planet from the God that doesn't exist. Therefore, it's a big old fat time waster, and I will not waste time discussing it. Which means in order for us to have a discussion, you better be talking about a God that manifests in reality. And that by definition, if it manifests in reality, then this is at least theoretically detectable, in which case you should be able to produce evidence. Yes, physical evidence, real evidence. And by the way, all of you who believe in it, who claim to have had these experiences, are claiming to be God detectors. How hard is that to get through your skull? Ooh, I felt the Holy Spirit coming through me, and I know that God healed my aunt of cancer. Well, congratulations. You've made a testable claim.
Have an Oreo, my son.
Thank you.
Oh.